Welcome, everybody. Welcome, James. Thank you very much for having you here. It's great to see you again. I hope it will be a quite interesting and fruitful conversation. So how we start, you gave a lecture, your contribution to us, and afterwards, of course, we have the possibility to ask you questions. What I would like to ask from the members and who are with us, that please keep it short, because then we can have more questions from more colleagues, and perhaps we can have the pace a little bit faster, and perhaps it could be more interesting for us to share the information and get the information and feedbacks from you, and of course from our colleagues. So I don't want to spend so much time with this introduction. I hope everyone is well and your families are okay also. And I wish you the same for the future. So, James, I would like to ask you to give us your opinion, ideas, and lessons that we have learned from this situation in the NATO family. James, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is that working okay?
Yeah, for me it's okay.
Perfect. Super. First, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm not quite sure where to look here, but thank you very much for the invitation to be here with you. I'm a Canadian, but I'm a big fan of Eurovision Song Contest, and I guess this is the closest I'm going to get to a similar setup. But I will do my best to entertain you all for a few minutes, and then we'll get to the questions and answers, which I think is most interesting. When it comes to what I'm going to say now, exactly as Attila said, this is mostly my views and opinion, just to stimulate discussion, of course, informed by what we do, but I don't want to just read you the NATO website. You know the official policies on everything. I think it's more important for us to have a real discussion. So there's been a lot of discussion of NATO's response to this crisis, and some questions about speed. I think I would say we've basically done a few things. The first, in terms of time, but also in terms of priority, was to ensure that what NATO does for a living remained effective. So we had to make sure that our collective defense remained strong, credible, and visibly credible, and we had to make sure that our operations remained functional. And that required less when it came to the collective defense, but more when it came to the operations, some adjustments. So our operational commanders focused immediately on ensuring that we had the right rotations or canceling the right rotations, that our troops were safe, that they didn't pose any risk to the communities they were in, for example, in the Baltic states. So the first priority was maintaining collective defense and maintaining our operational capabilities. And of course, you all know we had to make adjustments, for example, to Defender 2020, the big exercise which involved bringing, we had hoped bringing 20,000 American troops over from the US to Europe. It ended up being about 6,000, several thousand pieces of equipment as well, and moving equipment around in Europe that we had pre-positioned. The short tagline on that aspect is that is being done. It's being done effectively. Our commanders are very confident that while we've had to scale down some exercises, when it comes to collective defense and operational capability, we have what we need to do what we have to do. So that was priority one. Priority two, of course, was using what NATO has to support the effort by allies to respond to COVID-19. And of course, NATO is not built as a pandemic response organization, so it took a little while to go through all the tools that we had and see what could be applied. But actually, over the next few weeks, once we got going, I think we have actually ramped up pretty fast and provided some valuable capabilities. And I think you've seen some of these in the fact sheet that was distributed to you, but let me just run through a few things. One is, of course, that allies are using their NATO-trained armed forces in support of the civil authority in their own countries, including my country. That means with logistics, it means field hospitals, it means transporting patients, it means disinfecting public areas. So that's already happening. Second, through NATO, we have something called the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Relief Coordination Center. It's a long title. It's actually quite a little cell, but it's NATO's principal tool for civilian or civil emergency response. And in essence, it's a network. And there's a few people who sit in NATO headquarters, and they connect requests for support to donors who can provide support. So they're a network, and it's right across the Euro-Atlantic area. So it's not just allies, it's also partners all the way through to Central Asia, in fact, but certainly in the Caucasus as well. So as soon as this happened, and it runs 24/7, requests started coming in, and we've been matching up requests to donations. Turkey, through the EADRCC, has provided support to North Macedonia, to Montenegro, to Bosnia, to Spain, to Italy. The US has provided support to Italy. Luxembourg has donated support to Spain. Hungary has provided support to North Macedonia, along with Slovenia providing support. I mean, the Czech Republic has helped an enormous number of allies, including Spain and Italy. And there's more in the pipeline, and that includes for partners. So Georgia has requested support. I believe Poland has already provided support to them, and that was connected through the EADRCC. The US is looking at providing some as well. We have a couple of others that I can't yet discuss in public, but they are coming along. So we've beefed up this tool. It is getting more and more in terms of requests, but also in terms of responses. And the Secretary General is, where he can, trying to match these up, even at the highest level, to make sure things happen. So that's starting to roll as well, with real concrete support, including personal protective equipment, including ventilation equipment, field hospitals, etc. Then, third, we have the NATO Support and Procurement Agency. You probably all know it. It can and does make big purchases. It stockpiles, and it helps to transport. So we are using the NATO Support Agency to provide equipment where it needs to be provided. So we've provided ventilation equipment to Italy, personal protection equipment to Spain, medical supplies to Norway, some support to Luxembourg. So we're getting that agency involved as well. Then there's a third or fourth aspect, and that's airlift. And there's two parts to that. One is having planes. The reality is that most of the world's transport planes are on the ground. And so these military assets are actually quite useful. The second challenge with civilian aircraft is it's hard for them sometimes to go into highly infected areas because the plane has to be disinfected, because the crews have to go into quarantine. So the military actually can be very useful. We have been using two NATO tools, or NATO facilitated tools. One is called SALIS, one is called SAC, Strategic Airlift Capability. I don't want to go into all the details about how they work. The point is, a number of countries have used these planes that have been sort of pooled by NATO and are associated to NATO to transport personal protective equipment around. But the second aspect I wanted to mention is something called rapid air mobility. And that is, NATO has a mechanism whereby you can use a NATO call sign for your flights, and this gets you through a lot of the bureaucracy that would normally slow down transport between countries. So we have activated rapid air mobility, and a few countries are now starting to use it so that they can very quickly respond to requirements, go through airspace. It's all, of course, perfectly legal. These are NATO arrangements that were put in place a long time ago, but we've turned the key on these so that NATO allies can use them. So that's speeding up support by diminishing bureaucracy using NATO mechanisms. And of course, outside of the NATO context, allies are supporting each other all the time. And we really, of course, welcome that. So it's political solidarity. Finally, let me mention, before I turn to the next little segment, we're in discussions with the United Nations and with the European Union. Both of those organizations have supplies to move, a lot of resources to purchase equipment, to acquire supplies. We have a lot in the way of lift and mechanisms, as I just mentioned, this rapid air mobility to do it quickly. So we're discussing with them what more we can do. 3 more steps we're taking now, and then I'll turn to midterm effects that we, I think, all need to look out for. In terms of now, one of the areas in which we're really ramping up our efforts is countering disinformation. And this is probably something many of your countries are experiencing now. We see very clearly, in particular, Chinese and Russian disinformation. And the European Union has released a series of reports really detailing in an unequivocal and irrefutable way the amount of disinformation coming into our countries and into our neighborhood from China and Russia in particular. And the messages that they are pushing are many. They include that they're the ones providing support and we're not, that the authoritarian model, and I'll come back to that, is more effective, that the EU is unable to help its member states, that NATO is unable to help its member states, that this was a conspiracy, that the US was behind this and brought it to China, et cetera, et cetera. It is very active, it's very well financed, it's well organized. So we're working, NATO is working very closely with allies and with the European Union on a counter disinformation effort to monitor it, to refute it. And I can tell you we've also passed diplomatic messages also quietly to say to stop it. But this is something which we're going to have to all be very active in countering because it's a clear campaign. One more thing we're looking at is resilience. NATO has had, as part of the UN Charter, since it was founded, a responsibility to advise allies on resilient societies, right? Not just the military aspects, but how is your society resilient? And this has kind of sort of gone up and down in importance over time. It was important during the Cold War. It sort of faded. It's back, of course, for everybody. And allies are looking at this, partners are looking at this. The EU is very active, and we're very respectful of that. We also have active work in that regard. For example, we are looking within NATO and in a particular committee at 7 baseline requirements and updating them to make sure that they take account of COVID. So, for example, we need to look at the vulnerability of our supply chains. We need to look at the level of strategic reserves that we have. We need to look at the heavy reliance we have on the cyber infrastructure for our economic activity, for our communications, for our health services. I think COVID has only revealed all of that even more starkly. So we have allies now working with our experts to revise these baseline requirements and then share them with allies. And finally, in terms of current activity, we are preparing for the future. You might have seen some press reports on this. We are now preparing military planning to be better prepared in the coming weeks and months for a possible second wave, to make sure that we have a better, more planned and prepared support plan in place. Not just for allies, principally, of course, always for allies, but also to be open to supporting a few partners. And that brings me to the midterm effects. And I want to stress that these are my thoughts. They're not necessarily the thoughts of the organization, but there has been a discussion of midterm effects amongst ministers, which is coherent with this. One is we need to look at the effect on defense spending. And if you look at the Financial Times just over the last couple of days, there's been a sort of neat point-counterpoint. There was an editorial yesterday from someone saying, you see, the real threat is pandemic. We can't put as much money into defense and our economies are going to be down and we need to spend on health and on our economies. So defense spending has to decline. Then there was a response today from someone who said, and I think this is very much the NATO view as well, geopolitics haven't gone away. Geopolitical competition may even be made worse by COVID, and I think we can all see that unrolling before our eyes, and we cannot afford to not be secure because security is the foundation for the economic recovery and, in the grandest sense, for our health. So we have to find a way to do everything and maintain defense spending so that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, as we would say in English. Then another midterm effect which we have to watch, and that is the multiplier effect of COVID on our operational theaters and on other fragile states in our neighborhood. For example, the Middle East and North Africa. In Iraq and in Afghanistan, there are real challenges. These are countries without substantial resources, without strong governments, without strong health systems, and they're right next to Iran, which is a hotspot for COVID. They face insurgencies. So there is a very substantial risk to these countries that we need to watch for and take account of. But it's also the case that the Middle East and North Africa, which hasn't yet suffered substantially. Egypt has probably faced the worst COVID effects because of cruise ships on the Nile, but they too have weak economies. And I think the real risk there in all of these countries is social unrest, because they already faced high unemployment and weak economies. It's going to get much worse because they relied on tourism, and tourism isn't happening. And the net effect can be emboldened terrorist groups, weakened state structures, and of course, the risk of more illegal migration by people who really have very few options where they are. And if COVID spreads, then there'll be a health pressure as well. That's a second challenge. Third is China. And there's a lot to discuss with regard to China. But I think the midterm risks we have to take account, and I'm leaving aside the opportunities for cooperation. There are opportunities for cooperation. But the risks or the challenges that we have to watch for are, for example, we have to make sure that we protect our strategic industries and our strategic assets. They are going to be facing huge economic problems. China is coming out of this earlier than many other countries, and it has substantial strategic reserves, and it has a plan, Belt and Road and others. So we have to make sure that we don't end up selling off our crown jewels because of the financial difficulties we face. And it is very, very complicated. If the option is China buys them or they go bankrupt, then we have two bad choices to make. I think we have to watch for China in other parts of the world acquiring more control over rare earths, strategic minerals on which we rely. We are watching and have to be conscious of a more aggressive Chinese attitude in the Asia-Pacific region, including military pressure. And then there's this sort of macro issue, which I think is very relevant for parliamentarians, and that is the authoritarian model, the competition between the authoritarian model and the democratic model. Right now, the narrative coming from both Russia and China is, you see, our system works. And COVID is exacerbating the technological tools of authoritarianism because of surveillance technology, tracking technology, facial recognition technology, which we're all going to have to rely on for COVID reasons, but in non-democracies is used to control the population, and China is exporting this technology and helping to create a community of countries which take a different approach to human rights, to civil liberties, and who will follow China in those bodies that set norms, like UN bodies, like the International Telecommunications Union, which is already working on 6G. So the linkages to technology and authoritarianism and COVID are quite clear, actually, and we need to be not just watching it, but standing together to oppose it and make sure that our model, the democratic model, is effective and seen to be effective. Then there's Russia. I don't want to spend too much time on Russia in this context, just to say two things. One is the current Russian strategic doctrine, strategic culture, has a heavy element of surprise, of taking advantage of moments of instability to make an unexpected move. And it's called strategic surprise. This is all written down, it's very clear, it's not secret. They practice it, it's in their doctrine. So I think we need to be very vigilant now for unexpected moves. That could include, for example, instrumentalizing ethnic Russian communities in NATO countries, telling them that they're not getting good service, that the government isn't taking care of their health, that Russia could send doctors, Russia can help. So we need to be very, very vigilant about that as well. So these are some of the midterm effects. Now I'll conclude with just a few quick ideas for steps we can take going forward, and then I'd be very happy, because I've talked too long, to answer any questions you might have or hear your comments. I'd be very grateful for that. A few steps we can take. One is we need to help each other and be seen to be helping each other. This comes back to what I was saying before. We need to show the effectiveness of democratic systems, and we need to show our solidarity. And our opponents are trying to poke at that solidarity, to say, you know, see, we helped you, they didn't. So when we come late, when we don't show it, others take advantage of this. Second, we have to enhance our resilience. I mentioned these baseline requirements. We need to be more resilient in future against whatever might cause us to be reliant on others that might not be as tight with us as our allies. We need to help our partners who are at risk in the operational zones, in the neighborhoods near us, but also our Asia-Pacific partners who are facing a more aggressive China in their neighborhood. We need to step up our counter disinformation efforts. We are doing that, but they need to be much better resourced, in my view. I'm an ex-spokesman, but right now in NATO, we just don't have that many people who do this. They are doing incredible work with very, very limited resources, but as we say in English, quantity has a quality of its own, and our adversaries have more quantity. So we need to do that. We need to intensify cooperation with the European Union. The EU has every stake in this, like NATO does. Alone, the EU cannot be fully effective. NATO cannot be fully effective. I know as well as anyone, I think, all the complications in NATO-EU relations, but across the board, from disinformation to resilience to cyber to military mobility in the current context, to assistance to partners, cooperation with the European Union makes a lot of sense. We need to, as I mentioned, and I think parliamentarians are crucial here, we need to protect our strategic assets and our strategic industries from purchase from abroad at a time of financial difficulty. That has to be very conscious. We need to prepare for pandemic, that's clear, but in my view, we need to not overreact. This is huge, I get that, and many organizations and every country will have to adjust, and NATO too, but NATO can't lose sight, in my view, of job one. No other organization is responsible for the collective defense and deterrence of its members. NATO has to make sure we can do that, and beyond that, provide support when it comes to pandemic and adapt to do that, but not throw out our main role to focus exclusively on this. My final point, there is a reflection process underway. The Secretary General just launched it. He will lead it, and there are experts now hard at work on for the next 6, 8, 10 months, preparing recommendations on NATO's future. They will take account of this, but they are, based on what I've already seen, taken the broad look that I'm glad they're taking to make sure they're looking at all threats, all developments, the full globe, and their focus is on enhancing NATO's political role, not adapting NATO's military capabilities or role. That's quite clear and been decided. COVID will influence that, and it should, but it will not be all of it. So with that, and I'm so sorry to have talked for so long, let me hand the floor back to you, Attila.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was not long. It was just that we expected. So it's fine. So now we have some questions to you, and I would like to remind my colleagues that you should, hit the request, button on the right side of your computer to be able to see that you have a question. Now, okay, now we have more questions. So first, I would like to give the floor to Philippe from France. Philippe, the floor is yours, please.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Follow me. Thank you.
The first exercise on the French territory, NATO exercise, Lantern 2000 cooperation, was aimed at evacuating a major town towards middle-sized cities for a bacteriological and chemical shock that could be compared to a pandemic. And with the organization of posts for massive vaccination, and it was then that we integrated the countries of the Central European region nations from SHAPE. So what are the standards? What are the follow-up to this type of exercise in the NATO preparations?
Actually remember it, and I'm really glad you do as well. Our exercises, of course, cover a full range of activities. This was one of them, and I could name many more. All of our forces went back. So from a national point of view, they went back with lessons learned, and so did our partners. We've incorporated many of those lessons at a lower level in subsequent exercises, because that was quite a long time ago. And in various agencies and preparedness, it went into the baseline requirements. The challenge that we always have, and I come from a defense department before I came to NATO, is that, of course, the first responder in a crisis like this will always be the nation state. And France, like my country, is very strong in insisting that it is first and foremost the ally themselves that will take care of military activities in support of the civil power. So we have learned those lessons and incorporated them. I'll give you an example. My country has something called the Disaster Assistance Response Team. It's the DART, which is a rapidly deployable military unit, but that has, of course, a field hospital. We train on chemical, biological, radiological defense. We exercise on support to the civil authority. So I think all these lessons have been taken into account. What I'm quite sure of is in future crisis management exercises, both the kind that we hold at the headquarters and what we do in the field, these elements will now be much stronger. So I think the experience that we had in France was a good first step. We're going to be building on that. And I think the two elements that I mentioned, which is chemical, biological, radiological defense, and how to better support the civil authority, will be stronger elements in all of our countries' future exercises, and certainly in NATO's as well.
Much. The next one is Mr. Zsolt Németh from Hungary. Zsolt, the floor is yours, please. Zsolt?
to all of you from Hungary. Do you see me? I can see you. Hello, Attila. Do you see me?
Yes, yes, of course.
Okay. Dear friends, another greeting from Hungary besides Attila. As far as the COVID-19 development is concerned, it took us a major surprise. And now I believe we are in a very similar situation when we were after 9/11, when the kind of terrorism consciousness was born in the globe. And similarly, after Chernobyl, we had to realize that the nuclear consciousness is vitally important. So now it seems that a kind of health security consciousness is born globally and in our ranks as well. And we need to develop appropriate mechanisms to deal with this health security challenge in all fora, and I think NATO is also among those players who have to develop their own mechanisms to deal with health security challenges. Secondly, I would like to underline what was said just before me, the role of nation states and the role of the solidarity between nation states is vitally important. And this is not the time for continuing our internal divides in the West, educating each other and so on. But this is the high time to respect each other and to maintain the categories for authoritarianism. What is authoritarianism, as it was said about China and Russia? And inside the organization, inside NATO, to keep a clear principle of solidarity and cooperation with each other. And thirdly, I would like to underline the economic aspect. Our alliance is also an economic alliance since 1949. And the role of military spending and the role in the future of military industry in our economies and in our recovery might be a very instrumental and crucial aspect. So we should join into the economic efforts to, after the crisis, a kind of recovery process. And there, the military industry plays an important role. And my final remark is the Budapest-based Center of Excellence for Military Health. I would draw your attention to utilize the possibility in this Center of Excellence. They do a good job, and I think in the future, in the reflection process, this Budapest-based center must play a much more important role. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. James?
Thank you. Well, I agree with a lot of what Joel just said. Let me start where he finished, and just to note that 2 hours before this discussion, I sent up a note to the private office, which mentioned, in fact, this Center of Excellence for Military Medicine, precisely because I think that it has real potential, not just to help allies, but also to help some partners, because these Centers of Excellence, and this one is included, works with the European Union, but it also works with non-NATO countries. And this is exactly the kind of asset that we would like to be able to provide also to stricken countries that are not necessarily as strong as NATO countries, but in particular, like first to help them, but also because in particular, if they're in our neighborhood, the spillover effects of this particular crisis are going to be felt by us as well. We will not be as strong as we were 2 years ago in facing spillover effects, either economically or socially. So we have every interest in investing now in the health and security of our partners, especially in our neighborhood, because if we don't, we're going to feel the effects, and it's going to be a lot harder for us to handle it than it was a few years ago. When it comes to solidarity, when it comes to preparation, I think I discussed it extensively already.
Thank you very much. So the next one is Madeline, our former president. Madeline, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. James, I have to thank you for an excellent presentation. That was spot on. One of the things that we've grown used to is disinformation that has been fake news. But what seems to be happening now is a much more sort of parapolitical. So it's more lifestyle. It's more alternative issues. I've noted a greater stress, for example, on spending to go on health, but also on environmental issues. So are we making sure that allies are aware, and we're spreading awareness amongst our population around the lifestyle information and the fake news in relation to health and health treatment? Because the usual things are happening below that. That's the distrust in politicians, in governments, in state institutions, in experts. We need to keep that going. It's also about building a message about cutting defence spending in all of those settings where I've seen it. So we need to spend more on health, we need to spend more on the environment. And if we do that, we don't need defence. Just something that hasn't been raised, but I was very concerned to see the threats made against the Prague mayors about the removal of some obscure statue, and a threat to the extent that it would appear that an agent was sent with ricin to assassinate one of these Prague mayors. Now, are we looking at solidarity in that sort of scenario? Because certainly when the UK was attacked, we had massive amount of solidarity, and across the alliance there was the expelling of Russian diplomats. We mustn't lose that focus on the political solidarity where these extrajudicial legalistic threats are made, given the new law that Russia has enacted about 3 years in a hard labor camp for touching any Russian statues in former territories. So is that also being examined at the moment? Thank you.
Yes, please, James.
Now you can hear me. These are really, really important questions. First, on the question of solidarity, I can assure you that we keep our eye on Russian activities. You rightly mentioned the solidarity that the UK received from all allies over the Skripal case. The Netherlands also brought to the NATO table the results they had about Russian activities in The Hague and received the same solidarity from NATO. It wasn't quite as dramatic, but it was potentially lethal, but it was very serious. And I think this latest Czech issue highlights the extent to which Russia is now, to a certain extent, off the leash in terms of its intelligence activities outside of Russian borders. I mean, it is still, to me, unbelievable that these kind of activities take place, but they do take place. We have to be absolutely firm and united and transparent in responding to it. Very often these incidents are discovered based on intelligence. We want to handle that intelligence in the appropriate way and take steps that are appropriate to protecting the sources of that intelligence. You know as well as all of us how that works. So sometimes the response is obvious. That is usually when the government that has been running the country where this is taking place, the victim of it, chooses to go public. Sometimes we take steps that are less visible, but we are absolutely focused on it. You are absolutely right to continue to keep our focus on it. We cannot get distracted and let this sort of thing become normalized in our countries. It is absolutely, literally unacceptable. And we have to make sure that we are robust in responding to it. So I'm 100% with you. On disinformation, our colleagues, there's only so much I can say on this platform, but my colleagues who work on public diplomacy, strategic communications, press and media, are quite organized, have a very strategic approach that they are consulting with allies on a regular basis on what they see, how we need to organize to respond to it, what steps we need to take, how we need to resource it, where we need to do it, with what messages. So I can assure you that this is a very active discussion, and the NATO ambassadors are very, very focused on disinformation because they understand the corrosive political effect this can have. I am kind of gratified because it seems to me that most of our populations seem to be quite resistant to this. You might have seen the Lithuanians received a fake letter from the Secretary General, or purported to be from the Secretary General, and I can tell you it was very well done because it was his signature and it looks like the kinds of letters he sends. Saying that we were pulling our troops out of Lithuania because of COVID. This fell completely flat, totally failed to get anybody nervous because everybody has their eyes open. But with the general population, with the use of social media in particular to send very negative messages, and you're quite right, it's not just, oh, they're failing on this, it's, oh, you should be spending more on that. It is very, very clever. It is well done. To a certain extent, it resonates with people because, well, it's a legitimate thing to discuss. And just to close, I would say, you know, we don't want to be in a position to say, no, we shouldn't spend more on healthcare. No, you don't need to spend more on unemployment insurance or on stimulating the economy. We do need to do those things. The challenge is, of course, as I said, not to disarm and leave yourself exposed while you're doing that. We need to have the security behind which, or on the basis of which, we can do all the rest of the things we need to do. And 2% is still viable, even if the economies are smaller. That's still a number we need to reach. It is not a big number, it's a minimum number.
Thank you very much. And now the next speaker is Mimi Codelli. Please, Mimi.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Attila. Thank you, James. Well, it's always a pleasure to come back and discuss on these issues. Let me begin by saying that our last meeting, the 17th of February, I was where I had to in the meeting with you, and I very easily can remember a question that I did to one of the people which represent, which was presenting to us one of the nuclear strategies. And as usual, my question was a little bit political, but with a tendency that okay, nuclears, but what about pandemic and all the stuff coming, you know? And the answer was, of course, not a political one, but it was even not a technical one, unfortunately. Now, please allow us, dear friends, to think politically and have a serious discussion on this very, very important issue. Why I'm saying that? Because if I'm going back to my past as a Minister of Defense, or to the past of NATO, and looking very deep and very careful to the efforts we put on really important issues, but sometimes not thinking strategically. It's a pity I'm saying that. why I'm saying that. We have in our armed forces bacteriological and chemical units. And I'm really positively surprised what my French colleague said. Okay, we need to be focused on that for a second. Where were the intelligence services information and why they were not offering us the right information for the help which was coming, which was close to our doors? You rightly said, are the expenditures on the armed forces and on security and defense. We need, yes, to have exactly the same expenditures, but let's spend them in an intelligent way, in a strategical, intelligent way, in a political way, if you want. You rightly said, let's stay united. Oh yes, we are united, but we need to be even more united than that. And let me share with you the offer that we made to our very good friends Italians. In the middle of the pandemic time, we Albanians of 2 million people sent first at the beginning of April something like 30 doctors, physicians, and assistants to Italy, and then the next month 90 of them. And we are suffering the pandemic issue the same, but we did it because we do believe in staying united and supporting each other. And by the way, I have to thank you, the EU, for the support that they are giving to the Western Balkans in particular and to Albania for supporting our EU path of integration. And by saying that, I really need to thank you, James. People like you are open-minded, are smart, are well-prepared, and are offering us a lot of of thoughts and cases that we need to practice, we need to elaborate, and we need to develop them further for the best of our alliance, of our organizations, and the best of the future of our world. I'm very angry. I think that we haven't been so prepared in affording this thing. But lesson learned. I'm happy that we're still here, still standing, with the let's say with the hope that all the Russians of all kind, all the Chinese of all kind, all the terrorists of all kind, and the obscure forces are not going to be able to come out from this situation, them as winners. We are the winners, and we have to be the winners no matter what. Thank you very much.
Thank you. James?
Well, first of all, thank you for all those comments, and I'm quite sure Italians are very grateful because we all saw Albania's contribution, which is real people, real doctors, and that's very welcome. I would just say one thing, because I agree with a lot of what you've said. I think one of the challenges that we have is not that we don't get warnings, and as a former minister, you will have seen so many of them. My experience is we get warnings about everything. We get warnings all the time. We get warnings from experts of so many risks, things that could happen, from high probability and high impact to low probability and high impact to everything in between. And so the real challenge that we have is figuring out which ones might actually happen and how to allocate resources towards those things. So, the challenge, if you're a policymaker, and you're all policymakers, and those of us who are providing advice to you, is if I had gone a year ago to the Secretary General and said, we need to put a lot of resources from collective defense towards pandemic preparation, there would have had to have been a very difficult discussion about why we would do that. What were the odds it would happen? And then suddenly you're faced with this challenge. But this is not an excuse, because if you look at some countries, they were well prepared. They did have stockpiles. They did have ventilators. They did have masks. They had distributed them around the country so that everybody was prepared and knew what to do. So it's not to say you can't be prepared. You can. I think the challenge that we will now all have to wrestle with is, okay, where do we now calibrate the low probability, high impact events? How do we calibrate preparation for that? And how do we do that when we have 20% fewer resources than we did a year ago, greater demands to pump money into the economy, healthcare systems, which everybody will support, need to be strengthened? So, we're going to have harder questions, bigger demands, and fewer resources. So politics will be key.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now, Camille Aydin, the floor is yours. Camille.
Thank you, Attila. Thank you. Don't worry, I'm going to be very brief. And I would like to thank James for such a compact information about NATO's response to such a vicious problem, COVID-19. As far as I see, in order to get rid of, this pandemic, we have already given some recommendations to us for following up. Of course, by agreeing on most of the measures you mentioned, such as, coordination, cooperation against misinformation, and so on and so forth. Because, when we look at the main pillar of NATO, the main pillar is used as a kind of motto: one for all for one, which is based on complete solidarity and cooperation and coordination. On the one hand, I would like to ask you whether, honestly, because we have been being tested against such a virus, pandemic, disease, do you think that yes, we have already fulfilled the prerequisite of this kind of main motto? On the other hand, I really would like to ask you, because you have given some recommendations, and at the bottom of the list, you mentioned about resilience. With reference to resilience, you mainly indicated, the probability of the second wave. I really wonder whether we have got a very important intelligence information, clues, indications, or academic or scientific study, impinging upon such kind of likelihood. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a question. Yes,
thank you very much. Those are great questions. I just want to give my personal opinion on the solidarity issue. From what I can see, and this is my personal view, we did well in one area and we didn't do well in the other area. I think actually we have done well in the solidarity. Allies have supported each other. They supported each other with real resources across the Atlantic, the US to Europe, within Europe. And it may have taken a little while to get going, and that's what I'll come to in a second. But you know what, when I look at the way the Allies are cooperating politically and practically on this issue and preparing for the future, actually I find it quite reassuring. They argue about a lot of things, but when push came to shove on this issue, they've been quite tight. However, I would say there's two areas where we could have done better. One is to have moved faster. It took a while to gear up the machine. As I mentioned, that was for two reasons. One is because we focused first on the operations and on collective defense. And secondly, because we had to think through how to adapt NATO's tools for a pandemic response. So, okay, there were reasons, but it took a little while. And that brings me to the second point about communications. In the time it took us to respond, China and Russia were, in my view, fast and effective. They moved quickly. They provided aid in a way which was designed for strategic communications. So, for example, when Russia sent assistance to Italy, they didn't go straight to Bergamo, the hotspot center. They flew somewhere else and then drove through Italy with Russian flags on their vehicles. And even now, they take, they spend a lot of time focusing on their personnel in Italy. And there's a whole strategic communications campaign around it. They show video of Conte thanking the Russians, which, he should too, because they provided support, but they're instrumentalizing it. So my point is, I think we're providing assistance, and then we're building strategic communications to show that. But we didn't provide it quite as quickly in some cases as the Russians and the Chinese. And secondly, we haven't done it for strategic communications purposes, and therefore it hasn't had the same strategic communications effect. And so I think we need to, this again, my view, we need to take account of the strategic communications implications of our assistance and maximize that people see that it's allies doing it, that it's NATO doing it, because that's politics. I mean, you all know better than I do, strategic communications is at the heart of politics. And this is about showing solidarity, and we can do so much, but if we don't show it, people will only see someone else doing it. So I think that's where we could do much better. In terms of second wave, the pretty clear consensus, I would say, within NATO, but also in public, and I was just reading about it today in the New York Times, is a strong concern about a second wave. And that is based on all the factors which you can imagine, which is when they open borders, countries that are more infected because they're later on in this sort of curve will have people coming back to places that have already managed to sort of go through the first peak, and then you get the reinfection, etc. So, of course, I can't be any more sure. I'm no epidemiologist, but I would say the consensus view is there's a real risk of that. Certainly, the clear view in the staff is we have to at least prepare for it. If it doesn't happen, great. But it would be irresponsible for us not to make the necessary preparations to be able to provide better support in case it does, because at least it's a real possibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I cannot see Jerry. He was on the list, but now he's not on the list. So now I give the floor to Lara Martino, and I will close the list of the questions because we will run out of the time. So now we have the list, and I will follow that current list. Thank you very much. James, the floor is yours.
Well, why don't we go to Lara?
Thank you. So I would like to thank you, Attila and James. I'd like to thank you also for all the information that you already gave us. And I would just like to say first that given that every NATO economy will be under a tremendous strain in the coming years, it is for me hard to see how the 2% issue of allied defense spending will get any easier. But this is an issue that we will have to deal on the next years. I would like to focus on the NATO capacity to organize strategic airlift to support the fight against the pandemic, both in ally and partner countries. And these capabilities have already helped deliver protector gear and medical supplies, as you mentioned, to numerous allies and partners in Europe. And as the pandemic spreads future in the Middle East and Africa, NATO should also deploy its capabilities to help provide supplies and relief. So my question is, how can the alliance logistical and airlift capacity be a key asset in helping project stability to other regions such as North Africa and the Middle East as they combat the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you very much.
James.
Thank you. And here's where I think actually NATO really has a lot to offer in a number of ways. One is NATO's military planners are obviously, like all of our country's military planners, professional logisticians. So we can do logistics, we can do command and control, and we have a whole headquarters structure to do that. All of our countries have aircraft. So it's not just NATO and what it has as an organization, but of course every one of our countries, including mine, have substantial air forces that are available. And as I mentioned, the world's transport fleet on the commercial side is largely sitting on the ground and is not going to be moving anytime soon. So these military assets are very important. Then we have the strategic airlift capability. We have the SALIS as well, which is sort of a shared airtime flight hours arrangement. And we have this rapid air mobility for movement within NATO. So there are planes and there are technical arrangements to move them. But I think the point that you concluded on is one that I think is very important, and that is providing support to the Middle East, to North Africa, potentially to Sub-Saharan Africa. They will need support. We are discussing with the EU and the UN, as I mentioned, because they are purchasing supplies. They are acquiring substantial numbers of supplies. And so we're discussing with them whether they might make use of what we have to be able to move them around. So that's a discussion that's ongoing. All I can say is there's a very, very open mind in NATO about providing this. If they ask, I'm quite confident we'll be there to help, and that we have the technical resources, the aircraft, and the logistical capability to do it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And now, Ahmed. Ahmed Yildiz. Are you here? Perfect.
Okay. Can you hear me now, Attila?
Yes, yes, yes.
Thank you, thank you. James, briefly, you mentioned some examples of solidarity among the allies, but as far as I know from Turkey's case, some allies also send support to other countries, also like Turkey did for Somalia, for other countries. I am sure the other NATO countries also send some support to other countries. It will be good for public diplomacy of the allies to mention this by parliamentarians in the press and by NATO officials. I will be happy if you mention them, if you have any list, or you can send it to the group later. Then we can use that also. Another example of solidarity among the allies was and should be in the future about the evacuation of their citizens from allied countries mutually and from non-allied countries. This is important for Turkey, for example, especially we have a lot of diaspora labor in all countries. We are still making this operation from many countries, but the allies should be more cooperative on this, on the facilitation of this evacuation and quarantine conditions. And the other thing, as you mentioned, protecting these strategic industries in these difficult economic times, it will require in the future better economic solidarity among allies, especially soft loans or cheaper credit lines. I mean that the richer allies should be more understanding to the poorer ones to protect these industries from being purchased by non-allied countries, especially with some hidden strategic agendas. I hope that NATO should make some guidelines to the alliance on this, especially the economic institutions, especially in the US and the EU. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James.
Thank you. These are Very, very important questions. So first, let me say, I will immediately, after this discussion is finished, be in contact with my colleagues in NATO, and we will send through the NPA the latest information to all of you that you can use, and we'd be very grateful if you would use it. I think it's really, really important that we, exactly as you say, let people know what's actually happening. I will also pass on your points about evacuation of citizens, so thank you for making it. In political affairs, we don't necessarily have any authority over that, but I can pass the message on. The protection of industries issue is, for me, so important. We have a delicate discussion to have. For some allies, let's be very open. NATO's vocation does not include providing advice on strategic industries that don't relate to NATO's core business, if you see what I mean. That's for other organizations or for, of course, national governments to decide. So the way in which we have been looking at this question until now has largely been focused on the industries that are necessary for our national security and for the strategic infrastructure which is necessary for the movement of our troops for collective defense. So that's the sort of parameter within which NATO can provide advice on which strategic assets, ports, airfields, railways, cyber assets, or strategic industries when it relates to defense or critical components or supply chains that we depend on, then we can provide advice on that. To be honest with you, I think that's about as much as we, the staffs, military and civilians, can handle in terms of being able to really do the work, analyze it, and provide to allies professional advice on what they should consider, and it's a national decision or an EU decision, what they should focus on. But this is an active discussion already in NATO. I'm part of that discussion, and I know that now with COVID, we're going to be adapting the work that we have already started. This also, though, does require a dialogue with the European Union because the EU is also actively doing this. You've seen comments from, I believe, the Commission President very publicly saying this is a concern for them too, and they will set up their own guidelines, and we have to make sure that there's coherence for the countries that are in both, not for everybody, but for the countries that are in both, because they need to know what to do. So we will be in discussion with them as well. But I can assure you this work is already ongoing. It is being adapted because of COVID, and you're quite right to focus on it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now, Marietta. Marietta, please, the floor is yours.
It was very good that you prepare this internet discussion between us, not about solidarity only, but also to see what means for our countries and for the allies such a global threat 202 years after the Spanish influenza, who cost millions of lives in the world and especially in Europe. Now we have many capabilities, many means to face the problem, but and all the scientific society is ready to work in order to find a vaccine or a therapy, different medicaments. And our countries have to see, as Madeleine said, the health system. Probably many things have to change in the health system in order to face not only a second wave, probably a second wave, but generally speaking, other threats like this. In my country, for example, we face in a very effective way this pandemic. Only 147 deaths and only 2,600 cases. Our state was very effective, and the Greek citizens obeyed in details. And we are very prudent in order to face also the summer, because we are a country, the tourism is a very important economic mean. On the other side, Mr. Secretary James, you said we have not to overreact. What do you mean exactly? Because we see now that our economies are very heavy blessed. We have to work in a different way. Our GDP next year will be weak in countries, especially in countries like my country. But we have to see this case. I'm a medical doctor as professional. First of all, by the scientific way. And the politicians have to be, to hear the scientists. For example, the case of United Kingdom was very clear. They started in a different way, and at least what's happened? In Italy also, it was the same. In countries like Austria, Greece, etc., the situation is good, but we have to keep the system of keeping measures. So what is this, James, for you to not overreact? Thank you.
Please, James.
Thanks for that question. And let me say there is enormous respect for how Greece has handled this crisis. We've all seen the numbers and how well it's been managed. What I meant by not overreact is not to also underreact. I want to stress that. We all face this challenge, and we will for many, many years, and we have to invest in it. But what I meant was two things. First is we have to, as I mentioned, maintain the minimum necessary amount of defense spending, because we face challenges, including other countries, that will continue to invest in defense that do pose a threat to us, or a potential threat or challenge to us. And we cannot afford to be without defense. If we end up in that situation, then our citizens, I think, will quite rightly say, hey, how did you take your eye off this ball? This one you could see coming. You saw it for decades, or certainly for years, and you forgot about it. So that's one thing. And the second thing I meant was not to look to retool NATO to become a pandemic response organization. There are other organizations, starting from the World Health Organization, the EU with its particular mandates, etc., that have this as their, main vocation. Not the EU as its main vocation, but one of the areas where it can be involved. That's something NATO can contribute to, but it's not our main job. I have children, and like many of you, and one thing I noticed when I took my son when he was much younger to play soccer, was all the little boys, wherever the ball went, they all ran to where the ball was. Nobody played their position, and everywhere the ball went, the boys all went. We have to avoid doing that. We need to be aware of all the challenges, balance the risks, balance the expenses, and it's going to mean trade-offs. And I think the point that you made, that the economies are going to be cut and the requirements are going to be greater in certain areas than they have been until now, mean these trade-offs will be very difficult, politically very complicated. but they need to be discussed. There needs to be societal acceptance of them. And for us at NATO, maintaining defense spending and ensuring security is part of the balance.
Thank you very much. And now, Jean-Marie. Jean-Marie.
I will speak in French. Vous m'entendez?
You hear me? Can you hear me? Very well. I'd like to thank you for this very good presentation. Thanks for these very useful questions. I am myself under lockdown in Mulhouse. It is one of the original clusters of the virus in France. And I'm saying this because we had this experience of field hospital. It really helped us a lot. The French army set up this field hospital, and the army had to invent a very new method, although the army had extensive experience in Sahel and other regions. And I think Italy and other countries that have been impacted by this virus had some new experiences about this. And this new experience, this ability to work together on this medical and military problem is certainly one of the issues that is of concern to NATO. So that's my first comment, my first question. My second question was mentioned as well. I'd like to speak about a cyber risk. A few years ago, I had worked on that within NATO, and I could see that there were many vulnerabilities. I know that NATO has evolved considerably for a few years now, and we can see now that with this medical crisis, with those tensions with China, we can see now that the threat is quite strong. So do we have capabilities as NATO allies to react to those cyber vulnerabilities? And last question, on the operational level, we could see that our armed forces, a US submarine, a French submarine, were basically had to stop their operations due to the coronavirus crisis. And as you said, James, we are depending on national sovereignty, of course, but under the umbrella of NATO, there could be a solidarity in order to face this type of situation. So we have a virus now, but there could be other circumstances that could freeze all activities. So perhaps we could enjoy solidarity between allies without relinquishing our sovereignty. Thank you.
Let me address all three of those very interesting points. One is, I think you're absolutely right that many allies have experience in addressing challenges which, in other parts of the world, which actually can benefit us now. For example, operations in Africa or in places like Afghanistan, where we can adapt our current military medicine to the current challenge. Because I think you're quite right, most of our field hospitals are designed for trauma, for combat surgery. So adapting to this is something they've all gone through, the ones that have been deployed now in recent weeks and months, to deal with this. But I would go beyond that. I think this is actually an opportunity for us to engage constructively with partners that have more experience than we do. And I'll mention two groups. One is our Asia Pacific partners. They have had to deal with pandemics for years, like SARS, as we call it, sudden acute respiratory syndrome. And, we've all seen images that Asians are much more comfortable wearing masks, but their systems, and including their medical systems, are much better prepared for this kind of crisis. So one of the things we're doing now is setting up a dialogue with them to learn from them, not just what China is doing in their neighborhood, but also how have they built in resilience to their medical systems and to their hospitals and societies, in fact. The second thing I would mention is our African partners and friends. They have also dealt with different epidemics including, for example, Ebola. And I've learned a lot about how their societies and systems, without necessarily the same level of resources that we have very intelligently adapted to try to manage these challenges. For example, in many countries in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, in every little town or village, they have an epidemic, a person who's focused on that, whose job it is to look out for the symptoms, who gets the alerts from the central authority in every town to say, okay, these are the things you need to look for, who then consults with the people in the community. And if he or she gets reports of that, they have the phone and the phone number to communicate from wherever they are back to the center. Wait a second, it's here. You need to watch for it. This is just one of many examples. So I think that we can learn from them as well. So one of the things that we are also discussing is setting up a dialogue with our friends and also our partners in other regions of the world to learn from them and help us to adapt. So this is a two-way street. We may have more resources, maybe we don't, but maybe we do. But they might have more experience, more expertise that they are willing to share with us. Second, on cyber threats. We have clearly seen an uptick in cyber attacks since the pandemic began. Those are principally cyber attacks on medical facilities and on research facilities because other actors are trying to get the information on a vaccine and to be able to market it as quickly as possible, not just for the commercial advantages, but for the geopolitical advantages. But there have also been cyber attacks, cyber hacks. We are, as you said, much, much better off than we were 3-4 years ago in terms of our policies, in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of redundancy, in terms of cooperation with the European Union, where our cyber alert system and their cyber alert system alert each other so that we can have a common picture and, if possible, a coherent response to all of this. But cyber will also be part of these resilience guidelines. So I'm quite sure that we're going to get stronger as we go along, but we're very much focused on this as well. We need to do better, that's for sure. Finally, I think your last point was crucial, and that is if one ally is in a situation in which the pandemic is affecting their operational capability or even more their capacity to provide for their own defense, I'm of course 100% sure that other allies who are in a position to help them will do that, will backfill. And you know, we have to be conscious that militaries are very vulnerable in terms of their structures. They're often in confined spaces, lots of them in big ships, aircraft carriers, submarines, transport aircraft. Military formations are about proximity. They all sleep in the same facilities, they eat together, and that is the whole structure of a modern military for the last few hundred years, is to be together. And with modern platforms, to be together in very confined spaces. So there is a real risk, and our military personnel are not immune to this. So the commanders are being very careful. We're doing our best. I'm actually pretty satisfied with the relatively low impact because they've taken effective measures. But to finish where you finished, if allies need support from each other, NATO is the place to get it, and I'm quite sure they will get it.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you very much. And then next one is Andrea Orsini from Italy.
Will speak in Italian and so for the translators. Io vorrei prima di tutto esprimere la mia gratitudine come parlamentare italiano all'Albania per il generoso gesto di aiuto dato al nostro paese e le ancora più generose parole con le quali il primo ministro albanese ha voluto sottolineare l'invio di personale medico in aiuto dell'Italia. Non dimenticheremo questo gesto che rafforza la tradizionale amicizia, un tradizionale legame con l'Albania, che si conferma ancora una volta un paese di grande civiltà e di grande umanità, e volevo testimoniare questo alla Presidente Codeli. Detto questo, volevo invece fare una domanda un po' più di scenario rispetto a ciò di cui si è parlato fino adesso. Nei primi giorni della pandemia, Henry Kissinger scrisse un articolo di cui si è molto parlato sul Wall Street Journal, nel quale si diceva che il grande tema per i paesi democratici sarà salvaguardare l'ordine mondiale liberale dagli sconvolgimenti di tipo economico, sociale, politico che deriveranno da questa vicenda. Ora, come diceva prima il nostro relatore, che ringrazio, la lotta contro la pandemia in sé non è evidentemente il core business della NATO, ma la difesa di quello che Kissinger definisce ordine mondiale liberale, direi che invece è certamente il senso strategico dell'esistenza di un'alleanza che si fonda su questi valori. È abbastanza facile presumere che tutti i paesi liberi usciranno in qualche modo indeboliti da queste vicende. Io non credo che sia... Scusate, ho un ritorno della traduzione inglese che mi rende molto difficile continuare a parlare. Stavo dicendo, vediamo se adesso... io non credo che sia che abbia senso parlare di responsabilità della Cina in base a teorie più o meno fantasiose che vorrebbero che questa vicenda sia nata in un laboratorio cinese. Credo però che la Cina abbia delle responsabilità omissive nel non avere reso noto quello che è accaduto in tempi e modi utili, ma abbia anche un vantaggio competitivo oggi rispetto a noi. Concludo, abbia un vantaggio competitivo oggi.
Andrea, we had a problem with the English translation. That's what I wanted to show you. So I don't know, James, have you heard? Did you understand what he said? James, do you know?
Well,
do you understand?
To be honest, my Italian isn't what it should be, and I sort of missed most of it, but I think I got the general sense. So please accept my apologies if I'm not answering what you said. But in essence, if I understood correctly, you were talking about the geopolitics of what's going to come next with China in particular, with Russia, and that NATO needs to adapt to manage the geopolitical, or help to manage the geopolitical implications of all of this. And I'm 100% with you. And I believe that there's a risk is the wrong word, but there's a temptation, and a natural one, to focus on what's right in front of us. And that is the immediate challenge of saving lives, of moving personal protection equipment and ventilators around. And my concern about that is that other actors are playing geopolitics. There are geopolitical shifts underway. They are part of strategy, or they're not. They're a reaction to events. I think I saw a quote from Tony Blair once 20 years ago where he said, it was after 9/11, and he said, the kaleidoscope has been shaken and we need to move before the pieces all settle down. And I think that is exactly what's happening right now. The kaleidoscope has been shaken, the pieces are fluid, and we need to move. And I think we have all discussed together a whole number of steps that we need to take where I think NATO can play a part. I think we need to support our Asia-Pacific partners in their challenge in their region. We need to protect our own resilience against future challenges. We need to protect the democratic model. And protecting the democratic model doesn't just mean supporting each other. It means targeting the institutions where standards are set and acting together to protect Western standards. And that includes on surveillance. What is the right to privacy of an individual? What are human rights? What is the definition of human rights? For us, it's about individual liberty and freedom. Other countries, China says openly, I'm not maligning China here, they say this is not the first priority of human rights. For them, the first priority is economic prosperity and security. And if that means sacrificing your freedoms, well, that's okay. And in fact, you should. And they're working to change the definitions of those principles and acquiring allies in that quest. And that's a big geopolitical issue that we need to deal with. And then finally, the geopolitics of, even while we are facing such enormous challenges at home, going to where the problems are, where they might come back to us and worse, and trying to help the people there deal with them there so that they don't come to us. I don't want to say, this is not against migration. I am the son of an immigrant, but we don't want illegal or uncontrolled problems coming to us. We want to help the people there deal with their problems there, and then be able to manage, our relations with them in a proper way. So the geopolitics of this are going to be very, very traumatic. The relations between the US and China will be very much part of that. And right now they're sort of a mixed bag. But COVID will accelerate geopolitical transitions, and NATO needs to be part of managing them in a way which serves allies and which serves international security. I hope that was close to answering the question.
Thank you very much. And now the next who will ask you, Luca Frusone. Luca is not here, so we have the last question. I guess Christian, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me now? Okay, very good. I would like to talk a little bit about the practical way forward for NATO PA in this case. And I have been corresponding with Paul Cook quite some time, and he is prepared to write a special report on the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic consequences of it. And I will be the rapporteur for that report. And I hope that the NATO proper will coordinate and cooperate on such a report that he is drafting right now. And it was already planned to have a report on China, which I'm also the rapporteur for. So I will be busy doing these things. But I think it's very important that we do this fairly quickly, so we get so it makes it more interesting and more, let's say, up to date and things that we can work on right now, and also our national governments can work on. We talk about the long-term future. I just heard today that China actually reported an export plus in April from last year, and that's really surprised me. But that was due to medicine and medical supplies. And I also heard that Norway is 80% dependent on China and India when it gets to medical medicine in general. And that's, to me, very scary, and I didn't know that. And I think we all should be aware of this. It's probably the same for many other countries, and it's the reason why they have such huge surplus in export in these days, which is not the case for Norway. Let's put it that way. So it's, I think it's important that we work together and that you look at this together. That is not you don't have the one headquarters at NATO and you have NATO PA working in two different ways, but you work together and try to agree on the way ahead, the governments and all the politicians which are in opposition. Thank you.
Thank you, and of course we fully agree. And my particular division is responsible for relations with the NATO PA. So you don't have to convince us. We really see the value of this. But let me just mention that the reports that you're developing, I don't know what the timelines are, but the reflection group is going to consult with parliamentarians. I think they are always looking for good, solid reports in the next 4 or 5 months. So anything that you have that you can provide to the reflection group, I think would be really very welcome. We'll definitely read it. And of course, NATO and the Council will keep its regular engagement with the Parliamentary Assembly. That's very, very important for the Secretary General and important for all of us, and especially the ambassadors. But I think the reflection group is also a good opportunity to feed your ideas in, and then they'll feed their ideas to the Secretary General, and he'll feed his proposals to the allies. So there's a good moment here where everyone's looking for good ideas. So this is a good opportunity to take advantage of.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I agreed with the Secretary General to be involved in this as a NATO PA. So absolutely, we are on the track. So we try to organize ourselves to be able to provide important and useful information. So now we have, I think, Cheryl Gallant and two other questions. Yeah, two other questions we have, Cheryl Gallant and Luca Fusone. Cheryl, please. Can you hear something? James? No. Okay, I think, Ruxandra, we should skip and we should go to Luca. Luca, could you join us, Luca, and ask a question, and perhaps we can go back to Cheryl. Luca. Luca is here? Hello. Ruxandra, no one is on the line?
It's just you and me.
Okay. Now, James, then we can talk another hour about these questions, but then I think we should close this session for now. James, thank you very much for your excellent presentation and your time and precise information that we are needed. This is historical momentum because this was the first webinar in this regard. So we would like to go on with these type of conversations and dialogue. So I hope we can invite you again and again to share your views about these issues. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you for all of them who were involved, especially for the interpretations, because it was very useful for us to be able to understand each other. So thank you very much, James. Goodbye and take care. Take care. Thank you. Thank you.